Okay, good morning, everybody. Can you hear me all right? Getting some thumbs up. Okay. Okay, so thank you for joining this morning. My name is Diana Velez. I'm a public health assistant at Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium Epidemiology. And the special webinar today will be Male Experience Intimate Partner Violence and Associated Trauma, presented by Matthew Kozak. Does anybody have any questions before we get started? I saw in the chat a couple people asked if this was going to be recorded. It will be recorded and sent out. Okay, so no questions. I will go ahead and turn it over to Matthew. Thank you, Matthew.
All right, thank you. Good morning, everyone. I appreciate you all taking time out of your morning to come and participate in this presentation. Hopefully, it will be on a topic that you'll be able to learn quite a bit about. It's not something that I have personally seen discussed a whole lot in my last 8 or so years working in the field of prevention and tribal health. And so hopefully it'll be enlightening. I really appreciate the Epidemiology Center for helping to put this together. I was supposed to speak at the IHS grantee meeting earlier this March, but unfortunately had to cancel at the last minute due to illness. And so having the opportunity to do this makeup webinar is definitely appreciated. I will go ahead and share my screen. And one of the unique experiences of working in tribal health in rural Alaska is internet connections can sometimes be a little bit iffy. And so while I'm sharing my screen, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to turn off my camera just to hopefully prevent any audio disruptions and everything. Once the presentation is finished, I've made sure to leave some time for some questions and answers if anyone has any of those. And I will stop sharing the presentation and come back on camera for that. So if you'll give me just a moment to share my screen. All right, so can I get a thumbs up or something in the chat that everybody can see the presentation and that introductory slide? All right, fantastic. So as I said, my name is Matthew Kozak. I am the Wellness Programs Director with the Kodiak Area Native Association, serving 10 federally recognized tribes in Kodiak, Alaska, throughout our region. Today, I'm going to be talking about male experienced intimate partner violence, or IPV, and the associated trauma, some of the impacts with that, and then some of the barriers that men can encounter when seeking help. So looking at our learning objectives for this, to increase general knowledge about IPV and to some degree violence in general that's experienced by men, look at some of the potential outcomes that are associated with IPV related trauma in terms of health, understanding some of the unique barriers that are encountered by men who are seeking help for IPV or abuse, and then looking at some potential next steps forward.
Next steps.
So before I really dive into kind of the meat of the presentation, I wanted to mention there are some limitations in the research. I have done my best to make sure that all of the information being presented here is from peer-reviewed journals, articles, empirical research, or from people who either have lived experience or who have spent a long time working in the field of violence prevention and advocacy. That said, there are really limited studies examining male victim IPV specifically. What research is available rarely includes American Indian, Alaska Native, or other indigenous populations. And when it does, it's typically in that aggregate American Indian / Alaska Native. For those of us working in tribal health or with tribal backgrounds, I'm sure that you can recognize that there are some issues with generalizing across American Indian, Alaska Native populations. Even within Alaska, vastly different cultural groups, vastly different generational experiences. In addition, many of the studies here are based in other countries or in very specific sub areas of the United States. And as a result of that, the full scope of the problem when we're looking at male experienced IPV is very difficult to ascertain. And it can be really hard to generalize kind of across these different areas and these different topics, because again, the research just isn't there or it's not super consistent. So for example, I recently gave a presentation at a SAMHSA opioid summit, and I wanted to highlight this study, even though it's a little bit off to the side. They conducted a systematic review from 1998 through 2019, looking at studies that examined both intimate partner violence and opioid use. In that period, they only found 31 studies. In one of those subsets of 26 of those studies, only one of them looked at IPV victimization in males, while a second study included both females and males. And then within those studies, the IPV victimization rates ranged from somewhere between 6 to 94% based on different definitions, different populations, different groups. So again, there is some inconsistency in the research simply because there isn't that much of it. And a big part of that is, as this 2023 literature review notes, globally, IPV has been recognized as a gendered issue disproportionately affecting women. Therefore, much of what is currently known about IPV comes from samples of women, and in particular, cisgender heterosexual women in relationships with men. Although there is general consensus that men are also victims of IPV, relatively few studies have explored IPV against men. Because of a limited focus on men's experiences, how men define or conceptualize violence continues to be poorly understood. And that's going to be kind of a running theme throughout this presentation, is that concept of conceptualizing and defining violence in multiple dimensions. So with that, looking at male experienced IPV in and of itself as something that is occurring. So this is pulled from a 2018 publication by the US Office for Victims of Crime. And it essentially found that 1 in 4 men, approximately, have experienced some type of physical abuse, such as being slapped, pushed, shoved. 1 in 7 have experienced severe physical abuse, which is being struck with a fist or hard object, kicked, slammed against objects, being choked, burned, and so on. Nearly 50% of men have experienced psychologically aggressive behavior, like being kept track of, being insulted or humiliated, feeling threatened by a partner. And 4 in 10 have experienced some type of coercive control, such as isolation, blackmail, threats, economic control, and so on. The same publication essentially put forth that in their lifetime, approximately 47% of men will be victims of psychological aggression, 28% will experience some type of physical violence at the hands of an intimate partner, 7% will be victims of contact sexual violence, and 41% of American Indian or Alaska Native men will experience some form of IPV in their lifetime. That same article noted that approximately 1 in 19 men have been stalked to the extent that they felt very fearful or believed they or someone close to them would be harmed or killed. And about 50% of those, a little less than 50% of those, reported that their stalker was a female perpetrator. 13.5% of male high school students reported that they had experienced physical or sexual abuse at the hands of a dating partner. It was estimated that over 1.6 million men have reported being raped. And then from a 2014 study, 50% of men report experiencing at least one form of sexual aggression victimization, with a little less than 45% reporting minor sexual aggression, like verbal coercion, and nearly 1/3 of men experiencing severe sexual aggression, such as threats or the use of force. From a 2020 CDC fact sheet, 1 in 3 men will experience contact sexual violence, physical violence, and or stalking at the hands of an intimate partner. 56% of those experience that or other forms of violence before age 25. Nearly 1 in 4 men will experience contact sexual violence, and then 82% of men reporting sexual coercion and 53% reporting unwanted sexual contact noted only female perpetrators. Similarly, 97% of men who reported experiencing rape, physical violence, or stalking at the hands of an intimate partner reported only female perpetrators. Looking specifically at what limited data is available for our American Indian, Alaska Native populations, this is taken from a 2016 publication by the National Institute of Justice. It found that 83% of Indigenous adults have experienced some form of violence in their lifetime. They did a direct comparison of men and women, and they found that overall experiences of violence, 81.6% of men compared to 84.3% of women. But the way that violence is characterized, what it looks like, is different. So 73% of men compared to 66.5% of women reported experiencing psychological aggression. When you look at physical violence, it's only about 43% of men compared to 55.5% of women for, again, that physical violence. And ultimately, the lifetime victimization rate for American Indian, Alaska Native adults compared to their white counterparts was 1.2 times for women and 1.3 times for men. So this study is really interesting because it provides us with that direct comparison. And it's showing that the violence that is being experienced by men is, in many cases, comparable to the rates of violence that are being experienced by women. But the way that it's characterized is differently. It looks different. And as we move on to some of the other sections of this presentation, looking at the impacts of the trauma and the barriers that face when seeking help, that differential characterization is really going to come into play because it's a key predictor for a lot of those negative later in life outcomes. Similarly, looking at Indigenous men specifically, high rates of lifetime violence. Approximately 27.5% are estimated that they'll experience sexual violence, 43.2% physical violence, stalking, nearly 20%, and psychological aggression at the hands of a partner, nearly 75%.
2743.
When looking at reports and interviews with men who have experienced violence, it was found that 1 in 4 expressed concern for their safety. 1 in 5 reported that they had been physically injured by a partner. 1 in 10 missed work or school as a result of the abuse. And 1 in 6 excuse me, 1 in 6 who indicated that they needed services to assist them with the abuse could not access them at all. So again, the data can be spotty, for lack of a better term, because it's not a super well-researched topic. More research is being done, but what data is there is indicative of an epidemic of violence that is occurring that isn't really being talked about or discussed. And so as we're looking at some of the impacts of trauma and some of the barriers, one of the biggest components of that we'll get into in a bit more detail is just the lack of understanding about how prevalent violence against men can be and often is. So as we start looking at the impact of trauma, a meta-analysis of 58 studies on IPV from 2014, only 30% of the studies that these researchers looked at included males and females. Only 7% were male focused. So again, there's those limitations in the research. But what they were able to find is that a significant outcome of IPV related trauma is PTSD, with psychological violence being the key predictor for development of PTSD. That PTSD in IPV victims is then connected to depression, sleep disturbance, substance use, and suicidal ideation. Now, if we go back to just a few slides ago, with 75% of Indigenous men experiencing psychological aggression in their lifetime, and here we're seeing that psychological violence and aggression is a key predictor of a lot of these really negative later in life outcomes. So as we're looking at it, and we're kind of there's a natural inclination that people often have to compare, to say, oh, the violence experienced by this group is more serious or it's more severe. We're going to talk about that in a bit more detail. But as we're seeing the violence being characterized differently, it's very important to note that even if physical violence isn't as prominent, that psychological violence still is a key predictor of a lot of those negative outcomes. Similarly, along with PTSD, IPV more generally is connected to anxiety, psychological distress, and chronic physical health impacts. Again, there's kind of a lack of data, but what information is available shows that IPV is connected to self-reports of poor health, to heavier alcohol use, therapeutic drug use, recreational drug use, chronic disease, and then from a separate study, increased rates of smoking, drinking, and substance use.
Chronic disease.
A 2023 study found that male victims of IPV often reported high rates of difficulty sleeping, fair to poor mental health, and higher rates of disability. Now, what's interesting, and this again goes back to that idea of the violence being characterized differently or manifesting differently. Men who were slapped, pushed, or shoved, so that quote unquote minor physical violence, did not have a higher prevalence of health conditions than non-victims in the control group, while men experiencing stalking, severe physical violence, and sexual violence did have that higher prevalence for the health conditions this study was looking at. And I believe this study in particular looked at 23 different chronic health conditions. Now, polyvictimization, so multiple forms of IPV, showed a linear trend. So the more forms of violence you're experiencing, the more you are at risk of developing some of these chronic health conditions. That same study also did a comparison of female victims of IPV, and they found that sexual violence was associated with the largest number of health conditions, while for male victims, it was stalking followed by severe physical violence. Again, slapping, pushing, or shoving by an intimate partner was associated with increased prevalence of one of the health conditions they looked at in female victims, but none in male victims. And the authors of the study noted these findings shed light on important differences in the potential health impact of IPV victimization for women and men. We also know that when it comes to men with children, that IPV victims are more likely to have experienced or witnessed IPV as children, that experience or observation is later connected to victimization as well as negative mental health outcomes. It was also found in a study from 2014 that preschoolers of male victims often display affective problems, oppositional defiant problems, and pervasive developmental problems in school and other caretaker settings. While as those children get older and they move into that school age, they continue to display a lot of those same issues, but they also start displaying things like anxiety, ADHD, conduct problems, and physical health manifestations, that somatization of their mental health challenges stemming from witnessing and being affected by that IPV. IPV also has severe negative impacts on the ability of an individual to function in the workplace, which is tied to both the likelihood of abuse and the ability to escape abusive situations. For example, a 2009 study from the Department of Justice found that nearly 20% of employees in the workplace experienced IPV either at the hands of a coworker or were currently experiencing it in their lives. Those experiencing it currently reported higher rates of depression, lower self-esteem, reduced economic self-sufficiency, and increased family work conflict as that violence at home starts to bleed into the workplace. Furthermore, those who just had IPV at some point in their lifetime, higher rates of depression, lower self-esteem, and increased job insecurity. So again, that income and economic self-sufficiency being tied to both the likelihood of abuse and the ability to escape abusive situations. So the impact of IPV, I imagine that those of us who have worked in the domestic violence field or the field of behavioral health recognize the impacts that that has. But one of the key things to look at especially when we're talking about men who have experienced abuse, again, is how is the violence characterized and what effects does that have? So I just pulled those few studies that were available, and it's showing that even if the physical violence that men are experiencing isn't as severe and it isn't as common, the psychological violence that they often are reporting can have just as tremendous of an impact. So as we're looking at that, the next step is, okay, so if many, many men are experiencing this violence, and if the violence that they experience has all of these impacts, why aren't more men seeking help? What are some of the barriers that they're looking at? And the barriers for reporting and help seeking are kind of interesting because some of them are very similar to those that we see with women and children. Some of them are different and wholly unique. But oftentimes, the way that those issues are characterized, again, just like the violence is characterized differently, the barriers are often framed differently from the perspective of men. So, for example, we have emotional barriers. One of the most common ones is fear. However, men in these studies, and this is taken from studies in 2019, 2008, 2009, and it essentially found that men are much less likely to fear retaliation at the hands of their abuser. And instead, their more common expressions of fear are about not being believed or of being accused of perpetration themselves. A 2023 journal article noted a study noted that while physical violence was often used by female partners, it was rarely perceived as a tactic effective for controlling the man. Rather, most men described feeling in control of their female partner's physical aggression. Thus, on the whole, men seldom interpreted their female partner's physical violence as serious, intimidating, frightening, or as posing a genuine threat. So again, it's less the fear that they're going to be physically attacked or physically assaulted or abused if they attempt to report. It's more that people aren't going to believe them, take them seriously, or they'll be accused of being the perpetrator. There's also a massive construct of shame. So, for example, this is from a 2010 article. Men who report abuse from an intimate partner are viewed as cowards. Extremely embarrassed by this predicament, male victims are afraid of being laughed at or scorned. Due to embarrassment, male victims do not approach professional services. Apart from those internal emotional barriers, there's also a lot of social barriers that are associated with this. So, for example, when we were talking about fear and the idea that men are afraid that they'll be accused of being the perpetrator, there is that perception. So, for example, if males are victims of DV, it's due to the self-defense of women being abused. And the second quote is taken from an LA Times article about the opening of a men's only abuse shelter in Texas. And the person who was involved in the opening of the shelter and giving this interview had been involved in the field of domestic violence prevention and advocacy for, I believe, 30 plus years at that point. And she noted the biggest challenge these men face is that people don't believe them. We've gone through a lot of work to get to where women are believed, but now the pendulum has swung to the point that men are assumed to be the aggressor. Continuing to look at the kind of that social perception, there's also the idea that male victim abuse is just less serious. So a few quotes and studies. Men's violence against intimate female partners is considered more serious than women's violence against male partners. Both men and women judge male on female violence as being significantly more severe, and the above effect is even larger for male observers. So in this study from 2019, they took a large group of people and they presented them with hypothetical scenarios of an aggressor and a victim. And they asked people to rate them on a scale to see which was the most serious, which was the least serious. Female on male violence was considered the least serious overall, but male observers were much more likely to rate it near the bottom and putting that male on female violence at the top. Similarly, an Israeli study noted in a 2023 article found that when presented with hypothetical scenarios, Neighbors indicated they were most likely to intervene or assist in cases with a female victim of IPV, while scenarios with a male victim had the lowest behavioral response of all of the respondents. Similarly, I didn't include it here on the slide, but we also see this perception oftentimes in the media. So over the past 20, 30, 40 years, we've come a long way in terms of our television shows, movies, and other content, and the way that it handles the topic of female experienced violence. But male experienced domestic violence is still often portrayed, and it's often played up for laughs. It's a joke. It's not as serious as the opposite, that male on female violence. And then in some cases, there's just outright denial of the problem. This quote's pulled from a 2019 article. Despite evidence indicating that within some contexts, IPV is perpetrated equally by men and women, societal narratives typically portray male perpetrators and female victims and regard female perpetrated IPV as less serious and as occurring less frequently. The evidence of the prevalence of male victimization has been the subject of an ongoing and largely unresolved debate. So we're seeing that there are internal barriers, there are these social perceptions, and those things have real world practical impacts on the ability of men to seek help and access services. So for example, in the case of screening, one study from 2014 looked at over 1,000 men across 16 general practices in England. Only 13% of them said that they had ever been screened as a victim of IPV. Despite that, in 2021, looking at ER visits in the US, nearly 20%, almost 1 in 5 IPV-related visits to ERs were by male victims. In addition, male victims seeking ER services for IPV experienced many more injuries due to cutting and lacerations than their female counterparts, and men were more than twice as likely to be hospitalized due to the injuries they sustained. When we look at the response that law enforcement has, this is a little bit older, so this is from a 2010 study, but 47% of male victims in the study reported that they had been threatened with arrest, 35% were ignored, and in 21% of cases, they were arrested instead of the female perpetrator. And the authors note, this is due to the disbelief that a woman could not have been the perpetrator of this type of crime. And so the male must be intimidating the woman to the point that the woman is attacking in self-defense. So again, there's that concept of men are the perpetrators, and if men are experiencing violence, it's as a result of something they did, and the woman is retaliating or their partner is defending themselves. A 2019 study interviewed a male victim on police interaction. He said, "I was not only not listened to, I was threatened with arrest if I continued to make these allegations because women just do not do those sorts of things." From 2011, a study looked at law enforcement interactions, and they found that in cases where the female partner is identified as the primary aggressor, only about 41.5% of police asked the victim if they wanted their partner to be arrested. In 21% of cases, police refused to arrest the partner. In nearly 40%, police said there was nothing they could do and left. In 25% of qualitative accounts, male victims said the police did nothing and either ignored or dismissed them, with one male victim interviewed saying they determined she was the aggressor, but said that since I was a man, it was silly to arrest her. Beyond law enforcement, we also see differences in the protections afforded by the court system. So for example, this is a study that looked at court systems in Southern California, and it found that judges were more than 13 times likely to grant a TRO or temporary restraining order when it was requested by a female. They also found men were significantly less likely to seek a TRO to begin with. And when they interviewed men and asked them why they didn't seek one of those restraining orders, some of the things that they came up that were expressed and came up were, I wasn't as afraid. I didn't feel it was necessary. And again, that goes back to those emotional barriers and how the fear is often less about retaliation and physical violence as a result of reporting and more about either not being believed or being accused of perpetration. So here, they're less likely to seek restraining orders because there isn't necessarily that fear of experiencing further violence. But there's also a perception that their petition is more likely to be denied than if it was requested by a woman. And when we see a 13 times disparity, there is some truth to that. Furthermore, one of the other points that was brought up by the men in that study was that there was less assistance for navigating the process of applying for these restraining orders and navigating the court system. And when they did seek out assistance, they felt like they were either being judged or their complaints were being taken less seriously. So many of them expressed that they got discouraged and they didn't even bother to follow through on the process. In addition, male victims are often threatened with being accused as the perpetrator, either by the legal system or by their abusive partner. And courts have a differential response to male versus female protection, with the authors of this study in 2010 noting men just aren't often afforded the same level of protection or assistance. From 2019, evidence suggests male underreporting is related to a lack of trust in police and a fear of losing their relationships with their children. There's evidence that some female perpetrators capitalize on secondary abuse by threatening to report their victims as perpetrators of violence. This tactic relies on the inherent assumptions by many social service and justice workers that women are usually victims of violence and has been described as legal and administrative abuse. This type of abuse, in which legitimate services such as family courts are mobilized against the victim's interests, was common enough in a small Australian study to be identified as a wholly distinct category of abuse. So again, we're seeing how that social perception of male victimization is less serious, or it doesn't happen, or the man is the perpetrator. And here we're seeing that it has those real world impacts. We start seeing differential responses with law enforcement, with the court system. Aside from that, when we're looking at the non-legal system, so we're looking at other services, we see barriers in terms of just the language that's used. So for example, a 2019 study, male victims don't identify with the language that's often used in the context of IPV, such as domestic or family violence. A 2016 study that the authors in this 19 meta-analysis noted examined male victims in Portugal, and they found that 76% of them did not seek help. And the most common reason cited was, I did not notice that I was a victim. And some data suggests men are more responsive to non-gendered synonyms that don't have those social connotations. So examples were like boundary crossings instead of abuse. And that goes back to that quote that I pulled from that LA Times article about the opening of the men's only shelter, where we've worked so hard over the past 20, 30, 40 years and so on to get to the point where female experienced violence is taken seriously, that we've kind of swung in a direction where even men who are experiencing violence don't recognize that what they're experiencing is a form of abuse, because it's a quote unquote not something that happens to men. Others, these are both taken from a 2023 article in Trauma, Violence, and Abuse. Society in general does not endorse the idea that men can be victims of female perpetrated violence. Dominant social beliefs and expectations about men as potential victims may influence how men themselves view their victimization. Some researchers have even questioned the use of the term intimate partner violence with men, claiming that its significant gendered connotations may impact perceived masculinity. Some evidence suggests that when women perpetrate violence against men, it is not always perceived as abusive by men. So again, a lot of those societal perceptions are being internalized by men to the point that even when they are experiencing this violence, they don't fully recognize and process it. We also see barriers with services. As of October 2017, there were only 2 male-only shelters for domestic violence in the US. I check on this every now and then, and I have not been able to find any solid or concrete data about men's only shelters in the United States beyond the articles that came out in 2017 when that Texas shelter opened. We do know, however, that publicly funded shelters are required to provide service to men, but many of them have limited capacity or funding to do so. And many shelters and programs use gendered language that can give an impression of limited access. So for example, here in Kodiak, the primary resource for IPV is the Kodiak Women's Resource and Crisis Center. Now, their website, it indicates that they do not discriminate. Their services are available to anyone. We worked very closely with them, and anytime we go to a coalition meeting or a community event, they make it very clear in both their verbal presentations and in all of their written materials, their services are available to anyone who needs help. They receive many phone calls from people on their hotline, for men who contact their hotline seeking help with this. That said, their capacity to assist men is somewhat reduced. They have an on-site shelter. However, if you have several women or women with children who have experienced violence at the hands of a male partner, it's often not tenable to have a male victim of abuse sharing that space with them, even though they are both victims. And so their recourse is to coordinate with local hotels or B&Bs or the Salvation Army or the Brother Francis Homeless Shelter to try and get them placed. Now, being in a small rural area, that can become very cost prohibitive very quickly.
Yeah.
And you can also run into issues with lack of space.
Mine is Rhonda Baker, right?
That is mine. She's a OBW.
Who was the lady that I talked to you about?
Excuse me.
Remember a few weeks ago?
So it looks like
Or
someone
last
is not on mute and is having a
but I
conversation.
couldn't.
Marie Cochran, if you could please mute yourself.
I went ahead and muted her.
Okay, thank you. So continuing to look at services, this next series of slides is a little bit older. It's from a 2012 study in the Journal of Family Violence. And so these numbers probably don't accurately reflect where we are, but I want to provide a little bit of background about some of the context that male victims have experienced historically that might still be affecting perception today. So this study looked at men who had experienced violence, and it asked them about their experiences trying to access resources. So for men who tried to seek help through domestic violence agencies, about 44% of those they interviewed said that they went to a DV agency for help. And less than 45%, just a little bit, said it was somewhat or very helpful. Nearly 50% of the agencies contacted by men in this study indicated they only helped women. 44% of men said the agencies were not helpful at all. And 95% of those said they were given the impression the agency was biased against men. 40% of men contacting DV agencies for help were accused of being the actual batterer, and 15% said that they were mocked by staff for being in that situation and not being able to get themselves out of it. Looking at hotlines, about a quarter of men said that they had tried a hotline. Only about 30%, a little over 30%, said it was somewhat or very helpful. Nearly 65% of hotlines said we only help women. More than 30% accused the caller of being the batterer. And again, about 16.5% of callers said that they were mocked by the staff for being in that situation. For online resources, 43% of online resources, according to men in this study, responded we only help women. Nearly 20% accused the man of being the perpetrator. And in 25% of cases, men using online resources to escape abusive situations were provided contact information that ended up being for batterers intervention or anger management programs. Quotes from victims in that study regarding a DV agency, they didn't really listen to what I said. They assumed all abusers are men and said that I must accept that I was the abuser. They ridiculed me for not leaving my wife, ignoring the issues about what I would need to do to protect my 6 children and care for them. For a hotline, they offered to listen what I wanted to recount. They offered to listen if I wanted to recount what had happened, but indicated that no support services were available. And for an online resource, I was mostly just doing research after the occurrence to find out what I should do. I found mostly female help sites and was turned down by several, so I gave up. So again, that goes back to the idea I use the example of our shelter here in town, the Kozak Women's Resource and Crisis Center. Even though all of their services are available to anyone who's experiencing violence and needs help, and even though that's on all of their printed media, it's done in all of their verbal presentations, it's on their website, it's on their answering machine, all of those things. If you are a man who is experiencing violence and you are looking for resources, just the name of that organization and that agency is a potential barrier to accessing help. Now, these are just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to barriers. There's a lot of other things that just don't have time to cover. Sociocultural concepts of masculinity, such as the idea that victimization has been deeply coded as female experience, or male IPV victimization is incongruent with masculine gender norms. You have things like religious beliefs, such as the idea that marriage is sacred and divorce is a sin, and so you need to stay in the relationship regardless of abuse. Again, media portrayals, both in terms of how male experience violence is played up for comedic effect or it's downplayed as being less serious, but you also see things in reporting through news sources that minimizes male victims when reporting statistics. A great example of that was a 2019 BBC article that in the article itself, it noted, I believe it was around 20% of men have experienced some type of violence. But the image they used on the cover sheet was only women with no men. And so it's that example of that kind of minimization that the male experience violence is less serious, it's not as prominent, it's not as prevalent. There's also population-specific issues. So the idea that if you come forward with this, you're going to bring shame to your community, or you're going to increase racism, stereotyping, prejudice, bigotry, a lot of the same issues and things that we've seen in working with female experienced violence that just haven't been addressed on the male side so far. So I know we're kind of winding down. We're getting a little short on time. So looking at kind of moving forward, our next steps. And we are starting to see that the landscape is changing. More and more discussions about this topic, about male experienced violence, are occurring. There's more research being done on the topic. More services are broadening that approach, either as a result of their recognizing the issue or through regulation that is forcing them to adopt universal approaches. More providers are recognizing the seriousness and the scale of the issue and looking at ways to address it. As a great example of this, when I first started doing research to give presentations on this topic, I found this on the New York State Office for the Prevention of Domestic Violence. That was back in like spring of 2020. And some of the quotes I pulled from the page at the time were, women's attempts to dominate men are much more likely to fail. Norms for female behavior work against women becoming abusers. And ultimately, down at the bottom of this section, it said, we don't see heterosexual men whose self-esteem is destroyed by abuse, who give up school and career progress, who are forced into unwanted sex, or who flee for their lives. People intervene in abuse more than they used to. And if those men were out there, someone would have noticed. Contrast that with that same website in 2023. Domestic violence can happen to anyone. It looks different in every relationship, and no one experiences it in the same way. And the executive director of that office was quoted during DV Awareness Month outreach in 2023. Men often aren't engaged in this conversation at the level that women are, but they should be. And it's really important for us to understand how gender-based violence also impacts men and masculinity. And how do we get to that root? Because if we don't have those conversations, we're never going to end gender-based violence. So on the topic of outreach and engagement, men are often historically underrepresented in those outreach engagement efforts. And when they are being represented, it's often in the format or the context of men need to speak up, men need to stand up, they need to do more. We need to teach our boys not to be abusers. It's very much from a violence prevention standpoint. And as we're starting to see this conversation shift, and in looking at some of the things I highlighted here in this presentation, we really need to be having these conversations, not just about violence prevention from the perspective of men shouldn't abuse others, to the perspective of men can also be abused, we need to teach them how to recognize that, when to ask for help, how to ask for help. And we need to be broadening that violence prevention message to encompass everyone, because violence is not a unilateral thing. It's not being done by a single group and affecting only a single group. All groups commit violence, and all groups have violence committed against them. Now, there's also formal and informal methods of engaging with IPV victims. So some of the kind of the less formal methods that are more in my wheelhouse in the work that I do are things like adult male mentorship, and recognizing how important that is for adolescent younger boys, both from a violence prevention perspective and for processing and overcoming trauma and building healthier relationships later in their lives. You also have the idea of integrating respect as an aspect of culture for everyone, not just for men. When I first started doing this work and getting involved in this in 2015, there were things like Alaska men choose respect, and teach our boys not to abuse, and violence is not our culture, or violence is not our tradition. And it was very much targeted at, again, that men are often the abusers and perpetrators. We need to teach them not to do that. We need to take a violence prevention message and teach them not to commit violence. While the whole time, many of those men are experiencing violence themselves. So we need to broaden that perspective out and show that, respect, violence prevention, that is something that everyone should be involved in. Again, it's not unilateral. It's not one group committing and one group being victimized. We can also work to facilitate space for men to process trauma in a healthy, positive manner. Men working with men in those less formal settings allows for many of the stigma and barriers that we talked about to be bypassed. We can also provide spaces for paternal figures, such as fathers, grandfathers, uncles, older brothers, whatever it is, to interact with adolescent and younger boys and discuss the importance of respect and healthy boundaries. Again, going in both directions and facilitating those spaces where you can have those conversations in safe, supportive environments, and teaching those paternal figures how to have those conversations and why it's important to have those conversations with those younger men. Working with male advocates can help address feelings of shame, provide their perspective about the importance of culture on well-being. And we can also work to provide opportunities for mentorship in those non-traditional, informal settings. There is something to be said about giving presentations like this, or going to health fairs or tabling events and providing information. But there's also something to be said about taking kids out on a hike or taking them out fishing and using that as an opportunity to facilitate these conversations in that non-formal environment. For next steps, for a little bit more of the kind of formal things that can be worked on, for medical and behavioral health practices, look at screening tools that are validated to work with non-female populations. In one of the studies I looked at, they assessed a bunch of different tools that were designed to screen for IPV, and they found that essentially these tools don't necessarily work for men. And again, that kind of goes back to that issue of the language and some of those preconceived notions that even men have internalized about what they're experiencing for violence or in terms of violence. Adopting gender-neutral screening practices. This is becoming much more prevalent. Many accreditation bodies now require universal screenings. There are others that don't, and there are agencies that still use the either, well, we screen women and children, or they use the red flag method, where if a provider or an advocate notices something that they feel is concerning or a potential warning sign, then they'll conduct a screening. The problem with those methods is if you have a universal female and children screening, you're leaving out the male population. And if you have a screening process that's based on identified red flags, you start getting into those issues of, well, what are our preconceived notions, our perceptions, our biases, and are we missing things or overlooking things within certain populations because we feel that it's unlikely? So adopting those universal practices is the best way to move forward. Educating providers about the seriousness of this topic and the prevalence of it. So again, if you're using those red flag methods, making sure that providers recognize that this is something to look for and this is something to watch out for. I know that elder abuse, for example, and elder abuse screenings have been something that I'm hearing more and more conversations about over the last 10 years or so, because people are recognizing what a major issue it is. And so by educating providers, they're better able to know what to look for and what questions to ask and when to follow up. For the legal system, similarly, training for first responders. We saw those studies that looked at how law enforcement are interacting with male victims of abuse. That can be offset by training to adopt more universal policies and procedures. And many of law enforcement agencies have done so. There is essentially a zero tolerance policy. If you are engaged in domestic violence and you're the perpetrator, then you get taken away. It doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman. So removing some of, again, that individual bias and that individual judgment can help create a little bit more parity. Greater advocacy within the legal system, so you don't run into the things that we saw in that study of the courtrooms, where you have a 13 times disparity in the grant rate for restraining orders when people request them. For the public, improving awareness of the issue. Again, a lot of these things are just based on social perception and how that has real world impacts. So improving public awareness, working to reduce stigma, actively countering harmful messaging. For our services, work on language improvement, adopt male-friendly, if not male-focused services, so that if men are seeking help, they know that they can go somewhere and they won't be judged for it, they won't be mocked for it, or they won't be turned away because they're the wrong sex or the wrong gender. Staff training. So again, people are recognizing that this is an issue, that it's very prevalent, that it's very serious, and it needs to be treated just as we would with female victim abuse or with child abuse. So kind of summarize all of that presentation. I know it's a lot of information, but male experienced IPV is real, and it's a lot more prevalent than we think it is. The trauma that results from that IPV has lifelong effects, both for the victims and for the people that they're connected to. Men who experience IPV face numerous internal and external barriers when they're seeking help. However, male experienced IPV is something that can be addressed if we're willing to have that conversation. And I do want to highlight that, addressing the topic of male experienced IPV is not in any way diminishing or attempting to minimize the violence that is experienced by women. This is not our violence is worse than your violence, so we should have these resources or this attention. Violence, regardless of who is perpetrating and regardless of who is experiencing it, should be unacceptable. And up to this point, an entire segment of the population has essentially been left out of one side of that conversation to a large degree. And so having that conversation, but not going down the road of this group is more victimized, this group is more deserving, that is not a healthy way to approach this. And it's not a way to make lasting, sustainable change. So with that, I know that we have about 5 minutes or so, and I'm happy to take any questions if people have them.
And I'm going to drop in the chat. I'm going to drop in the chat the disclosure and the survey link to get continuing education credits again. Did you guys hear that?
So I'm scrolling back through the chat here, and I'm seeing some really good conversations and really good experiences. And I definitely I want to echo a lot of those sentiments. There are several things here talking about low reporting. And underreporting has often been something that has been very well known when we talk about child abuse, when we talk about female experienced violence. I would argue that it's potentially even more serious when we're talking about male experienced violence. In the lead up to this presentation, I had about an hour and a half long conversation with the director of our Child Advocacy Center, and she was talking about the disparity between young boys who experience violence versus young girls, and the way that it's treated and the way that it's approached and the way that disclosures happen. And she said that I know for a fact, I don't have the numbers to show it, but I know for a fact that it is happening almost as often with young boys as it is with young girls. They just don't disclose because they haven't been taught to recognize it, and they haven't been taught the importance of disclosing. And we see that even as people go on later in life. Again, that study from Portugal, 76% of men never sought help for their abuse. And the most common reason is I didn't recognize I was being abused. Jade, I saw your question in the chat. That unfortunately I can't provide a lot of good input on. I will say that my work in this field has very much focused on the public education component because, as I said, we work super closely with our Women's Resource and Crisis Center. They have a full team of advocates, and so anytime we encounter those situations, we pass them over to them as the subject matter experts, as the people who have that experience and who have the resources to assist with that. So unfortunately, in that specific situation, I can't necessarily provide more advice beyond kind of some of the general things that I talk about dealing with mental health and with suicide, which is just maintain that open door, maintain that connection, let them know that you're available when they're ready, because especially if it's a recent incident, they might not be ready to talk about it. They might not be willing to talk about it. And again, we talked about, there's fear, there's shame, there's embarrassment, there's demasculation, especially if it was a male who's assaulted by another male. And so just giving them that time and giving them that space, letting them know that that door is open, I think is going to have the best positive results. But someone who has been in the field of advocacy more may be able to offer different advice or better advice. So Casey, assessments don't necessarily adequately capture male IPV victims. Unfortunately, I am not familiar off the top of my head with a study or with a screening tool that is super universal. Again, it's a little bit outside my wheelhouse. The study that I was citing there, they had assessed several of them and they were not able to find one. And so one of their key recommendations was the development of a screening tool. If anybody is aware of a universal violence screening tool, I would be happy to take that information. And I'm sure that would be super useful if you were able to put that in the chat or provide that. Serena, a website about educational data and resources for Native populations regarding male IPV. There are a couple of resources that I was able to find, and I'm looking back through my presentation here on the other screen. I'm happy to provide a copy of this presentation. It has all of the research and all of the resources cited. I think I'm up to 15 something reference pages now, and it cites everything in the notes. But one thing that I found that was very useful is it was a 2010 publication called Building DV Healthcare Responses in Indian Country, a Promising Practices Report. And that really did approach whole violence prevention. And so I would say it's a little bit older. Again, it's from 2010, but it was a really good resource. And I can put that in the chat.
Thank you, everyone, for attending. If we don't have any other questions, you all are free to go. We did record the presentation. We'll send it out. Make sure to click on the link to get your continuing education credits in the chat. Thank you, Matthew.
Yeah, thank you for having me and setting this up. I appreciate it.
Yeah.